I am your zoology teacher from Vidya Ashram Career Institute. Today we are going to start with class 11th, first chapter, the living world. Okay. So our chapter is the living world. So this chapter includes living. Okay. What is living? How would we call an organism living? How an organism is said to be living? कोई organism living कैसे कहलाता है? तो where there are certain characteristic features, characteristics that we need to notice in a living organism. What were those living characteristic features that we are going to focus or notice in a living organism? That is respiration. Every living organism respires. So respiration is one of the important characteristic features of the living, such as reproduction. Reproduction is also one of the important characteristic features of the living organisms. The living organisms also show the growth. This is very important point. Growth. If the organism is showing living characteristic feature, they must respire, they must reproduce, they must show growth, as well as they will show metabolism. This is one of the very important characteristic features of the living organisms. You must be aware at this particular point that what exactly mean by metabolism. Most of the students do not know about the actual meaning of the metabolism. So today we are going to discuss about the metabolism as well. What is the metabolism? How do we define the metabolism? Metabolism is the sum total of all the reactions that takes place in a cell. Here you must notice one thing very precisely that you have to remember every time. The sum total of all the reactions that takes place within a cell. Every cell must carry forward certain kind of reactions within to survive, to being a living. So there are a lot of reactions that takes place simultaneously within a cell. That particular sum total of all the reactions that takes place within the cell is called as metabolism. If somehow some of the reaction is stopped, the functioning of the cell will also be stopped. That is very important to know. The very important characteristic feature of living is the metabolism. How do we define this sum total of all the reaction? Some of the students must not understand the mechanism of reactions, how these reactions simultaneously take place within the cell. So I describe it very carefully for you that A is a reactant and B is another reactant. It might be present in a cell, any of the reactant, and when they react, they will combine with each other and they will form another molecule. When they form another molecule, this is a larger molecule and these two are the smaller reactants. So by the joining of the two reactants, we get a larger molecule. How we make energy? Energy is a big molecule. A lot of energy is released. This kind of a reaction, in which there is a big molecule which is produced by the joining of two smaller molecules within our cell, is called as anabolism. Anabolism. But simultaneously, whenever there is an anabolic reaction takes place within our cell, simultaneously the catabolic reaction also takes place within the cell. Like A plus AB, a bigger molecule which you take in within your body must be broken down into some smaller molecules such as A and B. This particular reaction is a process by which certain molecules is being broken down. So that reaction is called as a catabolic reaction. Catabolism. Metabolic. So, in each and every cell, anabolic reaction is simultaneously taking place within with the catabolic reaction also. And the sum total of anabolism and catabolism altogether is called as a metabolism. So, give me an example of a reaction that takes place within a cell which shows about the actual metabolic reaction. So, a very simple reaction which I have always told my students as an example is a photosynthetic reaction in which CO2 plus H2O, it will form C6H12O6 plus oxygen, which is liberated. So what is happening here? CO2 and H2O. The CO2 is a smaller molecule, and water is a small molecule. These two smaller molecules combine with each other and they will form AB, certain byproducts. So this is a reaction that is said to be anabolic reaction. So whenever the photosynthetic reaction takes place within a cell, that is a anabolic reaction that takes place within that cell, which is the producing of glucose, production of the glucose, by which the glucose is being produced. It is the anabolic reaction. Simultaneously, if we look the reaction at this side, this particular side, this AB is being broken down into A plus B. Yes, we know this reaction. Also, simultaneously within a plant cell, whenever there is a photosynthetic reaction is going on, the respiration is also taking place. What is happening in the aerobic respiration? The oxygen, in the presence of oxygen, the carbohydrate is being broken down into carbohydrate and the water. So this is a catabolic reaction. So are you aware that these two reactions simultaneously takes place within a cell? So this is metabolism. This is the metabolism. So there is a one very short line which I am going to describe you in a very short sentence, that metabolism is the defining or non-defining property of the living. You have to understand this. I must tell you that metabolism is the reaction that cannot take place in a test tube. Why the metabolism cannot happen in the test tube? Because in a test tube, at a particular time, either anabolism takes place or catabolism takes place. But metabolism is a simultaneous reaction, the sum total of all the reactions. So the metabolism is a defining property of the living. That is a very important point of today, that you have to understand defining property or the characteristic feature. What is the defining character? Defining character is that metabolism is the defining character, because if you take metabolism away from the cell will not be living anymore. That is very important point. Now let us consider the growth. The growth is non-defining property. The growth is the non-defining property. Why the growth is not defining? The growth is not defining property because the Himalaya is also growing at a constant rate. Because Himalaya is also growing at a constant rate, the type of the growth takes place in Himalaya is called as extrinsic growth. Extrinsic growth. Whereas the growth actually takes place within a cell is called as the intrinsic growth. So the growth is a non-defining property. Now let us talk about the reproduction, sir. Reproduction is also the non-defining property, because if we take the reproduction away, the living organism can said to be a living organism. So that the reproduction is a non-defining property. Some of you might get confused about this reproduction. So let us talk about the reproduction also. So reproduction is the non-defining property. Why the reproduction is non-defining property? Because have you ever heard about the mule? That is an example. Mule. The mule is a cross between a donkey and a horse. जब कुछ लोग हिली एरियाज में जाते हैं और बुजुर्ग लोग जो होते हैं और जब उनको हिल एरियाज में चढ़ाई की तरफ जाना होता है तो they cannot go by themselves. तो उनको एक म्यूल के ऊपर बैठाया जाए और वो उससे सारे जा सकते हैं क्योंकि म्यूल डंकी और हॉर्स के बीच का क्रॉस है. क्योंकि म्यूल डंकी और हॉर्स के बीच का क्रॉस है तो उसके बाद हॉर्स के भी कैरेक्टरिस्टिक हैं और डंकी के भी, इसलिए वो ज्यादा स्ट्रॉन्ग है दोनों. बट म्यूल के अंदर रिप्रोडक्शन की एबिलिटी नहीं होती क्योंकि वो इसलिए वो स्टेराइल होता है. इसलिए वो स्टेराइल होता है क्योंकि म्यूल स्टेराइल है, उसके अंदर रिप्रोडक्शन की कैपेबिलिटी नहीं है. इसलिए जो लोग हिल एरियाज में गए हैं उनसे अगर पूछा जाएगा कि भाई आप म्यूल पे बैठे क्या वो लिविंग था तो वो तो उसको हाँ ही बोलने वाले. बट रिप्रोडक्शन की प्रॉपर्टी ना होते हुए भी वो लिविंग है. दैट मींस रिप्रोडक्शन इज नॉन डिफाइनिंग. ये कोई डिफाइन करने वाली नहीं है प्रॉपर्टी. नॉन डिफाइनिंग प्रॉपर्टी है, नॉन डिफाइनिंग कैरेक्टरिस्टिक है, कैरेक्टरिस्टिक फीचर है, नॉन डिफाइनिंग. बहुत सारे ऐसे ह्यूमन बीइंग्स भी हो सकते हैं, बहुत सारे ऐसे और एनिमल्स भी हो सकते हैं जिनके अंदर रिप्रोडक्शन करने की कैपेबिलिटी किसी तरह से नहीं हो पाएगी, नहीं काम कर रहे, तो क्या हम उन्हें लिविंग नहीं कहेंगे? Reproduction is not defining property. Next property of the living is consciousness. Consciousness or responsiveness. Consciousness or responsiveness. So consciousness or responsiveness is the ability to show a response around your environment with any of the change into your surrounding. Okay, if there is any change in your surrounding and you respond particularly to that change, that is called as consciousness or responsiveness, and it is a very important characteristic feature of the living. Because every living must respond. If someone is not responding, you might be confused either it is living or not. But the question is, how we can say that consciousness or responsiveness is a defining or a non-defining property or a characteristic feature? So there is a question, there is an example to understand this. There is an example. If a person is in coma, अगर कोई पर्सन कोमा में है तो वो क्या आपको रिस्पॉन्स कर रहा है? नहीं, वो आपको रिस्पॉन्स नहीं कर रहा. ऐसे पर्सन को क्या हम डेड कहते हैं? नहीं, वो लिविंग है क्योंकि अभी उसके बॉडी में कुछ तरह के रिस्पॉन्स हो रहे हैं. इसलिए हम कॉन्शियसनेस और रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज को दो तरह के प्रॉपर्टीज में डिवाइड करते हैं, दो तरह के पॉइंट्स में डिवाइड करते हैं. आइदर इट इज द एक्सटर्नल, how we respond to our environment, how we respond to a certain change across our environment, around our environment, that is externally, and internal also. So the response is of two types, the external response and internal response. The person who is in coma is not responding its external stimulants, but if there are certain organs which are functioning in its body, so its body or its organs internally showing the response towards it. That is why the person is not said to be dead. He is said to be living. So the consciousness or responsiveness is a defining property, defining characteristic feature. So what are the other characteristics characteristic features of living, apart from the respiration, reproduction, growth and metabolism, there might be certain other characteristic features such as locomotion, such as nutrition, such as protoplasm, such as adaptability. So there are certain characteristic features of the living. These are the certain characteristic features of the living, and the living is said to be living if that particular living organism is showing these characteristic features, such as respiration, reproduction, growth, metabolism, reproduction, consciousness, locomotion, nutrition, protoplasm, and adaptability. So this is the introductory part of the living world. What other things that we have to understand in this particular chapter is how do we know what we are going to do about the living? How would we study? How would we summarize? So to summarize all these living organisms, what we have to do? There are lot of living organisms present around us. How many? 1.7 to 1.8 million. That means if we notice about the properties of the living, about 1.7 to 1.8 million organisms around us are said to be living. So there are a huge number. And into this 1.5 million and 0.2 million are living organisms. They are said to be, most of the time, they are said to be animals, and they are plants. So, because there are a lot of organisms around us, this particular lot of numbers in the living show the diversity. This is called as the diversity. So there are very huge range of diversity among the living around us. How do we study all of them? There is a need to classify them, to categorize them, to understand them at certain level. So what we need to do? We need to do certain things. We need to do certain things such as nomenclature. We have give a certain name to the organisms. Nomenclature. Then identification. We have to identify. The third thing what we have to do that what the scientist shows is classification, categorization. And the last thing what scientist has to do is the classification. So what we understood till now, we understood what are the characteristic features of living, which organisms are categorized as living, are said to be living organisms. When we know that there are a lot of organisms present around us which are showing certain characteristic features of living, so we need to understand that there is a huge diversity is present among the living organisms. So what we need to do, we need to classify them. For the classification, we are doing the nomenclature. We name them. And to name them, to name them and to know about all the living organisms, we have to identify them. Identification is a very important characteristic feature, very important step in the classification. To identify each of the organisms, we have to categorize them. How do we categorize? How do we categorize the organisms? We have to understand the similarity and the differences. So, to understand the similarity and the differences, we have to identify each and every characteristic feature of living. Then we can name them, nomenclature. So these are the major steps of classification of the organism. But when we classify each and every living organism, living organism, it is very convenient for us to study them, to understand the features, to understand them, to understand the anatomy and the morphology of the living organisms. To understand them, to teach, to read them, to study about them, we need to do four major things. What scientists have done? They name them, nomenclature. They identify them, they categorize them into a particular category, and then they classify them. That is what the living world told us. Let us talk about the nomenclature first. Nomenclature. Earlier there was a biologist called as Aristotle. Yes, father of biology. Aristotle divided the living organisms, the animals, into two groups. Aristotle divides the animal into two groups. Either the organism with the red blood, which is having the red blood, and the organism which do not have the red blood. The Aristotle first of all divided. Now then another scientist came, that is called as the Linnaeus. What Linnaeus has done, Linnaeus has divided the whole biological world, the whole living organisms into two categories, called as the two kingdom classification. Then Linnaeus divides the plants, kingdom plantae, and the animals, animalia. The two kingdom classification was proposed by the Carolus Linnaeus. So there is a lot of confusion when they do these types of divisions, classifications, categorizations. Why? Many of the organisms categorize under the kingdom plantae, but they show the different characters. So it is difficult to remember, it is difficult to study them all. So there is a need to divide, to categorize the whole biological world into certain difference very urgently. So there is a third scientist came, and the name is R.H. Whittaker. This is the most acceptable type of the classification till now. He divided the whole biological world into 5 kingdoms. So R.H. Whittaker proposed the 5 kingdom classification, and once the 5 kingdom classification has given, we separated the kingdom plantae on the basis of the cell wall and the type of the cell. So what is the basis of dividing the whole biological world into 5 kingdoms by R.H. Whittaker? First, the cell structure. Then the cell wall presence, the presence of the cell wall, either it is present or not. If the cell wall is present, the cell wall ka composition. If the cell wall is present, and the composition of the cell wall is being there, the mode of nutrition. Mode of nutrition. So how the RH we take classify the 5 kingdom classification, that is the basis of the classification is very important. That is the structure of the cell, the presence of the cell wall, the composition of the cell wall, and the mode of nutrition. They are the basis of categorization of the whole biological world into different kingdoms. So how the 5 kingdoms are, when the 5 kingdoms are divided, what are the 5 kingdoms? There are Monera. The kingdom of Monera includes all the prokaryotes. In the next lecture, I will describe what are the prokaryotes, how the RH taker classify the Monera, and which of these prokaryotes are categorized into the kingdom Monera. Then another group is Protista. Because the cell structure can be on the basis of the nucleus, either it is a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell. So the prokaryotes are all unicellular, whereas the Protista are unicellular eukaryotes. Unicellular eukaryotes are categorized in the kingdom Protista, and the third group is the presence of the cell wall. When the cell wall is presence of the cell wall, and when the cell wall is present, either it will be made up of chitin or the cellulose. The third is the mode of nutrition. Mode of nutrition is either the autotrophs or the heterotrophs. So when we understood the cell wall presence and it is made up of chitin, it is the third group called as the fungi. And the mode is heterotrophic. When the cell wall is present and is made up of cellulose, it is the kingdom Plantae. So we have the 4 groups: Monera, Protista, fungi, and Plantae. And another autotrophs are cellulose. Autotrophs are those which are having the cell wall made up of cellulose. And the last group is the cell wall is absent, and that is heterotrophic mode of nutrition, and is called as kingdom Animalia. So it is a very good classification system, most accepted type of the classification which is done by RH Whittaker. The another scientist we are going to talk about the nomenclature is called as the Carlin. Another scientist is on. We are talking about the nomenclature, and the scientist which is associated with the nomenclature is Carlin. Actual name is Carolus Linnaeus. It is the Latinized name, Carlin. The Carolus Linnaeus proposed the binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature. What is the binomial nomenclature? According to the binomial nomenclature, every living organism must give two certain names. The first name is describing its genus, and the second name is describing its specific epithet. That is very important. The genus is represented by the capital letter. There are certain rules for the binomial nomenclature proposed by Carolus Linnaeus. The first rule is it has 2 names. First represents its genus, second name represents its specific epithet. The genus starts with capital letter, and the specific epithet starts with a small letter. The second rule is that it is in always in Latin word, Latin language. So there must be a question. Sir, why only the Carolus Linnaeus why propose that every binomial nomenclature, every name of the organism must be in Latin language because it is a dead language, and we cannot change it. So it must be universal way. It cannot be changed according to it. So some of the scientists, okay, also called Carolus Linnaeus as Carlin. It is Latinized name, kind of. Okay. So the third rule is either you write it in Latin language, the specific epithet and the genus must be italicized. If you print it somewhere, the specific epithet and the genus must be italicized in italics. So sometimes you also write the name. So when you write the name, writing the specific epithet and the genus must be underlined. That are the specific rules for the binomial nomenclature proposed by the Carolus Linnaeus. So there is an example, the name of mango, Mangifera indica. Mangifera indica, the Mangifera represents the genus and indica represents the species, specific epithet. This starts with the capital letter, this starts with a smaller letter. I underline it very carefully because I cannot write it in italics. Whenever you write, you must underline it. So this is all about today's lecture about the living world. In our next lecture, we will continue with this lecture furthermore to understand what are the more categorizations, more rules that follows in the classification and to understand the living organisms and the diversity of living organisms. How can we do to understand, to study them more frequently and more easily? There are certain rules. Till then, thank you so much.